I dreamed I saw Joey last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. I never died, says
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Kenner-Grissom, and I'm the Director of Special Projects and Programs for Yiddishkayt. And I want to welcome you to our In Conversation With series. In February of this year, we presented 6 virtual live performances of Anthony Russell's My Own Personal Robeson, The House We Live In. This project was the culmination of several years of creative exploration for Anthony in collaboration with us here at Yiddishkayt. However, as we'll hear about, the seeds for this project were planted years before. For those of you who didn't experience this piece, My Own Personal Robeson was anchored by 2 short films created by Anthony, which we're going to see tonight. The piece also included 2 brief live interviews with members of the audience, 2 monologues, a performance medley, and original text that was either written or spoken by Paul Robeson, which was beautifully brought to life by Anthony. We're thrilled to have this opportunity to convene an intimate conversation with Anthony and our executive director, Rob Adler Peckerar, to discuss the thoughts and ideas that went into creating this exciting new work. And so first, I'd like to welcome Anthony to the screen. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me this evening.
Cool. So Anthony, just a little bit about Anthony. Anthony is a true multi-hyphenate. He's an acclaimed vocalist, performer, composer, and arranger specializing in music in the Yiddish language, as well as an activist. So welcome, Anthony.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to bring on Rob Adler Peckerar. Here we go. Hello. Rob is Yiddishkayt's executive director, as well as a leading scholar and translator of Yiddish literature. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, Anthony.
Hey.
Nice to be with everyone. So let's dive right in. My first question is to Anthony. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us what did this project give you an opportunity to do that other performances or programs that you've been involved with haven't?
That's a great question. I think having comprehensively branded myself as a performer of Yiddish, but also as someone who, perhaps a bit self-consciously, uses my repertoire in Yiddish as a mode of self-expression, which, let me tell you, wasn't exactly the most intuitive artistic choice as a queer Black convert to Judaism. I wanted to create an opportunity to explore what it means to inhabit a group of texts that directly depicted or addressed not only my existence as a Black person in America, but also underlined the political undercurrents and agencies behind being a performer of these particular texts, what these texts mean or could mean outside of the realm of performance. Of course, in Robeson, I had the perfect figure in which to simultaneously inhabit the performative and the political from the stance of the Black performer, but it also gave me an opportunity to explore my own positionality as a Black performer, reconciling my work with the reality of my political existence. Mm-hmm. In a word.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. And I think what we'll do, just to orient our audience a little bit before we continue on and sort of unpack all of that, let's give folks the opportunity to watch the first film that was part of, that sort of opened up the piece that we screened in February. So let's kick it off with My Own Personal Robeson.
I've been a classical vocalist for over half my life. It hasn't been easy. When a black man gets on stage and opens his mouth, the expectation is that things are supposed to happen. It's taken me years to figure out exactly what's supposed to happen. Whether I'm supposed to merely entertain my audience, or move them to tears, or inspire them, convincing them of my essential humanity, or to remind them of their own, or whether there's even enough space for me to experience those things too. The tears, the inspiration, the humanity. Whether, when I step off the stage, the world is a slightly different place, a slightly better place for me and the audience than when we all arrived there. I'm still in the middle of finding this out. I was compared to Paul Robeson for the first time as a teenager in the late 90s. It strikes me as almost irresponsible. What an immense weight to lay on the thin shoulders of a teenager. A passing resemblance to one of the greatest vocalists and humanitarians of the 20th century. What did it mean? It's not that I particularly sounded or looked like Paul Robeson. We're both black and male-identified. And the thing about being black is that you don't have to even look remotely like another black person for you to remind a not black person of another black person. You just have to be black and present, and for better or worse, the resemblance is made. Now, of course, we both sing in the lowest reaches of the human voice, though his reaches are inarguably lower and richer than mine. But I've managed. I've never wanted for lowness or richness of voice. We've both sung in a number of languages, though for very different reasons and with rather different outcomes. As a former opera singer, my languages have initially come out of a European hegemonic superimposition of classical music on the world. Robeson came by his languages through an embrace of the world, and having more or less left conventional classical music behind, I've been trying to find ways of using my voice to embrace the world too. For the past 9 years, that has happened primarily in Yiddish, the 1,000-year-old tongue of Ashkenazi Jewry. One language among the many Robeson sang in his embodiment of a vibrant, melodic, multilingual humanity. We've both been tasked with being more than just a performer. I think this is partially because of the undue weight the 20th century had on blackness, even on black performers. For better or worse, I'm a child of the 20th century, the same one in which Robeson came into his own. A century in which the act of opening one's mouth was an act of immense vulnerability and potentially of unimaginable strength. Now, firmly in the midst of the 21st century, in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, I can't help looking back to the 20th century where I first encountered Paul Robeson. I find myself wanting to complicate what that encounter was supposed to mean, if it ever meant anything at all. To someone, at some point, I vaguely reminded them of Paul Robeson. But where was the political engagement, the motivation, the consciousness the utterance of his name could have introduced into that encounter, along with the mention of the insurgent lowness and beauty of his voice? Where are the innovations, the reforms, the radical equalities Robeson fought for? What happened to the revolutionary potential of his performance on the performer and on the audience? As a performer of Yiddish, I've become quite accustomed to singing the songs of a land without a flag. Where is the land for which Robeson's voice was a flag? Who is Paul Robeson in the 21st century? Where does he end? And where do we begin?
Hi, we're back. So much to talk about in terms of process, but before we go there, I'd love to talk about sort of the origin story of this piece. And I know it goes back to Anthony's time as a Helix Fellow. So I'd love, Robbie, if you can take a few moments and just explain to us, for the audience listening, what Helix is.
Sure. So the Helix Fellowship, the Wallace Annenberg Helix Fellowship, is an arts and scholarly fellowship. And it is a way that we at Yiddishkayt bring artists and cultural historians and scholars of Jewish culture, but also of wider cultural movements throughout Eastern and Central Europe, but even sometimes even broader, come together, form a community of artists and scholars together. We do some community building among this group that becomes a community of itself, and we travel. It culminates in travel in Eastern and Central Europe. So every year we have generally gone to. Mostly we travel in Belarus up until very recently, and also parts all over the historic Pale of Settlement. So in Belarus, what is today Belarus, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine. And the idea really is to connect people who either are engaged in this region thematically or culturally, and to bring people to those places to see it for themselves, to see the landscape, to encounter it, to recognize something about the material spaces that are encountered when you actually travel to these places. And part of it also was to demythologize a little bit of these spaces too, that, when people are performing or they're representing Eastern Europe, Jewish Eastern Europe in particular ways, there are ways that people often think about places, the Städtlich, as being, imaginary, that they are this kind of fictive space, this Fiddler on the Roof fantasy of what Eastern Europe is or was. So it's really important. Was always a really important idea to bring people to encounter it, even though the spaces are, of course, not the same as when they were inhabited by masses of Jews. For the most part, when we travel in northeastern Europe or in Belarus and in Lithuania, we go to places that were historically majority Jewish spaces, which of course are no longer after the Nazi genocide, after population transfers, after emigration. But there's a way that we try to bring back a multilingual history and see kind of the layers and strata of history as we travel and bring artists together to encounter this together. And a lot of what we do is read together in places where writers wrote and created, or we sing together publicly in public spaces to bring in an audio soundtrack to the regions that we travel to bring the sounds of multilingual, polylingual cultural life back to spaces which have become largely homogenous and largely monolingual. So there's a lot that we do on the trip, and so it's nearly a month of travel together. And one of the ideas was to bring together scholars and artists together, is a major part of the trip, to teach one another, to learn from one another. And a lot of really interesting work has come out of it. I mean, the fellowship right before Anthony's had both the late David Schneer, who is my dear friend, whose birthday was just yesterday, who came on that trip, and he teamed up on that trip with another great singer who also recently passed away, Julia Eisberg, to create an anti-fascist performance piece that they took around. And so the idea was really to inspire new work that would engage our historical moment today that's inspired by these places in the past. That's a long description, I guess. But
no, I love all that. That's fantastic. And I think that leads us right into, Anthony, I'm curious, before you went on the trip, did you have any sort of ideas about something you might create, or were you sparked on the trip itself, and how were you sparked?
I don't think I really had any sort of concrete ideas about sort of creatively engaging with the memory of Robeson before this. Robeson was just a consistent theme kind of in my life since I, started performing as a teenager, as I said in the video. It's funny, there's a photograph in the video where I'm pointing to a wall where it says Robeson performed here 80 years ago. And that was at La Sala Rosa, which used to be a union hall in Montreal. And I had a gig at La Sala Rosa. So when I was backstage, that's where I found that. And that was, number of years before this project sort of came to fruition, or sort of, came to be. I think it's interesting that on the trip, we eventually ended up talking, Robbie and I, about Paul Robeson, because for me, the trip was important in a sense because I needed to make an effort, and the trip allowed me to make an effort in order to find what the continuities were between myself and the various spaces in which I was interacting with, and also between myself and the culture and the history that I was interacting with as well. It's always been very hard for me as a performer of Yiddish who doesn't have that as a part of my family background, as part of my Yerusha, to really figure out how to situate myself in relationship to this history and this culture. And I think it's fascinating that taking this trip to Central and Eastern Europe, in trying to sort of orient myself to these places and to this history and to this culture, Paul Robeson came up in the contents of that, just because he was another polylingual Black performer who traveled all over the world, like I had been, and hopefully will be again once things get a little bit more under control with coronavirus. So it's interesting that in trying to sort of orient myself to historic and cultural Jewish space, along with all the co-territorial peoples that Jews lived with in Central and Eastern Europe, I also was sort of oriented to Robeson as well, maybe more closely than I ever had been, being in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And, yeah, that's fantastic. And then Robbie, I'm curious how it's so interesting. So Anthony, you came, you had sort of these ideas percolating, and Robbie, you had your own ideas that started to percolate, and they kind of coalesced. You can tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Anthony and I have sort of different, little Rashomon versions of the way that we've created the ideas of these things came our way. But one thing that I remember is that when Anthony sang an Yiddishkayt poem in Minsk, and it's also important to recognize that this was happening in 2017, that we were traveling. I think that's actually quite important.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of conversations about what anti-fascism, we were having a lot of conversations about what response to fascism can look like, or what it meant to perform anti-fascist work at that moment in the new age of Trumpism ascending. And so I think I was inspired when a performer, when Anthony was performing in Minsk, a place where we had talked a lot about members of the Anti-Fascist Committee, Shlomo Michoels, who was a Yiddish actor who had lived and worked in Minsk and was actually murdered outside of Minsk. And of course, Yiddishkayt, all these other writers who were parts of these kinds of anti-fascist, progressive movements. And we were thinking a lot about them. And so, yeah, I mean, that was, I think, one of the ways that I was thinking also about this overlap of what it meant to perform in a particular moment, in a historical moment, to look to historic models of anti-fascism, to look to ways that was performed and broadcast to a wider place. And of course, we were in a place that was a major city in the Soviet Union, an artistic capital of the Soviet Union. In fact, in Minsk, when I started thinking more about this too, and I think Anthony and I began our conversations there, my memory of when we started talking specifically about a new performance piece, although Anthony, I don't think remembers it the same way, is that we were on a train from Grodno to Bialystok, which was a crazy train ride with a lot of many eccentric people in our group behaving.
It was eventful. It was an eventful train.
It was
ride.
eventful. There were smugglers. There was all sorts of things happening. And one of the things I remember we were talking about on that train ride was actually we were talking about the performance that Rufus Wainwright had recently done at Carnegie Hall, which was a recreation of Judy Garland's performance, Judy at Carnegie Hall, that he had created, sort of basically like just redone as it restaged it, but there was a lot that was reflective, borrowed from, that engaged with the original performance of Judy Garland at Carnegie Hall. But one of the interesting things that we were talking about was the way that Judy Garland has functioned as this queer icon, especially for gay men. And that there was this interesting moment that Rufus Wainwright wanted to engage with that iconic figure and relate to it by performing it. And
a site-specific work, by the way. I think site
exactly.
specificity is actually kind of an interesting through line. I think initially in our conversation in Minsk, where I remember sort of the beginning of this project being, we were in a space where either Robeson had been, and that's why he'd come up as a subject during that part of the trip. So,
yeah. Absolutely. And then one of the things I think we were talking about on that train ride was a little bit about that performance, and that's, I think, when I was just like, what would it mean for a performer, especially a Black performer who has been hailed for so long as, that so many people come up to you after performing, especially performing for Jewish audiences in Yiddish, and they say, "Oh, you must know Paul Robeson," or you're the new Paul Robeson," or whatever they say to you, this kind of hailing of you as this figure. What would it mean in this to recreate that piece of that work? And I was thinking, since it was 2017, that it was coming up on the anniversary of Paul Robeson's Carnegie Hall concert, and this concert that came of it that became Songs of Free Men, which was this major anti-fascist concert that was multilingual. And I kind of pitched it to you, and I remember that you were very dubious. You were like, "No, that's not the kind of thing that I would do."
I was afraid that, like, once the Paul Robeson gates were open, I would be impersonating Paul Robeson my entire life, and I did not feel myself to necessarily be up to that task. And I think if, for people who were able to attend this performance project, you can see, like, I very directly sort of demarcated, like, this is Robeson and this is me, and then this is me inhabiting a space that I feel like I've been invited to inhabit by the memory, the history, and the texts of Robeson, as opposed to me trying to get up and trying to embody Robeson as if anyone could do that. I mean, people have tried. They should be blessed, but it's a tall order,
Yeah, I mean, when we had that we had a conversation, I think, maybe a year or so ago with Shauna Redman about about the way, the reimagining, the revivifying of Paul Robeson over the past number of decades. And there's been so many acts of impersonation, of ventriloquism, of even actual holograms being created that perform Robeson. And I think one of the things that we were initially talking about was what is the difference between a performance, like, for example, what Rufus Wainwright was doing, that was not an act of impersonation, but it was a revisiting. It's difficult to describe exactly what that was in terms of a performative sense, and what it would mean to do it with how would it be different? How could it be done with Robeson and done differently? And is it possible to do it without it being understood as an act of impersonation?
There's this complicated Hasidic story about going to the part of the forest, and saying particular words in order to affect changes on behalf of a Jewish community. And then like every generation has less and less of what that ritual was. And then finally, the only thing they can do is just go to the part of the forest and like, sort of hope that something will happen. And that's kind of what I wanted this performance to be. Is like, I don't necessarily have everything that Robeson had in order to make my case, but I did have his words and I did have his music, and I wanted to be able to use those things in order to create a living element of his political engagement as a performer for my audience.
So I actually want to bring in, because, okay, so there was this vision, Robbie had this idea of this live performance, and Anthony was trying to figure out, what iteration he might want to explore. And then the pandemic happens. And I remember we were talking about, virtual pieces and how, all of us were like, oh my God, Zoom, we don't want to do something like that. We at Yiddishkayt started to investigate other platforms. And so I'd love for you to talk about that transition, because I was in it with you when we sort of transitioned from that live reimagining to, okay, what can we do virtually that would be really unique, really engaging, and completely and utterly, you. So if you want to talk a little bit about that shift, would be really interesting.
Well, I was initially a bit gutted because I had had so many experiences being inspired by site specificity. And I want to be clear, like that we went to many places during our Helix trip, and the amount of work that those handful of places created over the intervening years between now and when I took that trip, the amount of work that's created in me is immense. It's been an immense period of like creativity for me. So I knew already that being in a specific site where something had happened was very inspirational to me. So not having access to that was a major roadblock for me, but it also gave me the opportunity to really build, I guess, in a sense, the rhetorical side of what this was. I mean, initially it was going to be kind of a straightforward performance in a space in which Robeson performed. And actually, Lisa, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of information, I guess to both of you, it's a space that I visited actually last week when I was in LA for an engagement that I had at UCLA last week. But originally the space, I'm trying to remember exactly.
Yeah, so we went to First Unitarian Church,
Right.
which is in Koreatown or Filipino town,
It's Koreatown.
Koreatown. And and so Wally Hilla, who was Robeson's accompanist, was the musical director at First Unitarian. So we took a tour there. We saw the sanctuary, beautiful. It's original, in its original seating, original state. Probably needs a little bit of restoration, but it looks great. And we were just really excited about, now that we're sort of kind of on the other side of the pandemic, hopefully on the other side of the pandemic, that maybe we could take what we did virtually into a site-specific space that has meaning.
I should say that we wanted to do it from the beginning. We were talking about wanting to do it at the Unitarian Church because it's this place where Paul Robeson had performed so many times in
also
LA.
It is a historically redolent space. I mean, you walk into that space and you are in the late 20s, 30s. You are moving through time being in that space just because of how well it's been.
I feel like preserved. The red part of redolent is also a significant part of that space too, which was its association with internationalism and leftist movements in LA. It's been a headquarters of that. So redolent is probably the best possible descriptor of that space.
And Robeson performed there many times. I think we figured out that he'd been there a handful of times in the 50s, and they have an archive there that we will delve into. But it was just really great to go there. Yeah, the original conception was to do it there, and we just took a trip there to see if we might be able to investigate it for the future. But I want to go back to something that you said about how your Helix trip, is sort of like fostering this creativity, and there's like many projects percolating. And Robbie, you often say that the experience works on us. And I wanted you to, both of you, to respond to that in some way.
It's interesting because I remember somebody, and it might have been Robbie, and it might have been somebody else involved in Yiddishkayt, saying, this trip is going to change your life. And I was like,
I didn't say that.
I don't remember who it was. Somebody said something along those lines. I remember being like, yeah, okay, whatever, we'll see. But
I assume it was Claire who told you that, but yes.
It might have been Claire.
Yeah.
But I think it's so rare that one actually gets a chance to interact with elements of Jewish culture so completely put into context, and then to be able to have a physical experience of that. And I think it came at a time where I felt very sort of insecure about my ability to be able to really replicate that in an authentic fashion, having not had the experience of Eastern European, Central European Jewish space, or even just space in general, you know. So there's been so much that I've sort of pulled out of that, and there's been many ways in which it's given me the freedom to be able to claim my right to be able to be inspired by this work and to create.
Because it feels more authentic now because you've been there.
Because I've had the experience, but also what it gave me, and this is really interesting for me, and I think directly involves this project, is the license to express my progressive political identity through this work in the same way that the progressive political identities of the artists informed their work in their spaces. Like, it allowed me to really examine what those things were and to figure out how to reconcile my work with my political reality.
And it's interesting because I think that there's ways that I think, and you probably have experienced this far more than others in many ways, but there's a way that I think in many, especially in small cultures, that there's a sense of people have a sense of propriety, where there's a proprietary nature where people, you know, have this claim, you know, and they demarcate things as being ours versus not, you know, and there's a way that I think that one of the ideas of the program, by taking people to these places, is to sort of free people up from that idea, these ideas of this proprietary sense of culture, and to recognize something that's universal, that transcends identities. And I hope that's one of the things that unfolds on the trip, because there are moments where we're engaging with all these different people and populations and histories, and there's a sense that no one can claim it as theirs anymore, in a certain sense, that there are these people who make all sorts of identitarian or biological or genealogical claims, but like, what is the work that's being done? What gets inspired by these places is something that's universal, something that people see about the way that people come together, the way that people act on behalf of their neighbors, the way that people cross borders. All of those things are things that are absolutely universal, and that while Jewish culture historically was this thriving part of that cultural landscape, right now, at this present moment, it's freed to inspire whomever wants to take it and do something with it. And that's one of the things that I hope people get out of this, that they can explore this space and take the elements of culture that call to them, whether that's, you know, the internationalist or progressive political aspects that were so dominant, and still the traces of course, in Belarus when we were there, you know, the traces of the Soviet Union are probably more prominent in Belarus than in any other former Soviet space. So there's a kind of an interesting way that I think that we want to invite people to pick up whatever thread that they can pick up and do and weave whatever they can from it.
Yeah, that's great.
It's interesting that you talk about proprietariness in relationship to Jewish culture, because, you know, we have Paul Robeson, who was actively singing in a historically Jewish language, And nobody really, he did it as a form of solidarity, of ethnic and political solidarity. And I think in a way, like, something about that model and something about the model of Helix as a program resonated for me, which is why I think I was able to sort of conceive of a way of engaging with Robeson that was, imbued with all of those things that I pulled out of the program. I also want to identify really quickly, going back to your last question, something else that happened between when we were really planning on creating this performance and when it finally happened, of course, was the death of George Floyd.
Yes.
And kind of the national reckoning, as I guess, any number of publications would put it, with racial injustice. And it felt even more pressing to me to accentuate those aspects of Robeson's repertoire and of his text, of his speeches, of his articles, of his interviews, and to bring that to the fore. And what that meant, to a certain extent, I thought this was really interesting, was really presenting a very different Robeson than a lot of other Robesons who I've encountered through other people's experiences of Paul Robeson. I know we were probably going to get to this at some point, but I had a little bit of pushback from some people because there was not any Yiddish content in my performance, or at least this iteration of this particular performance. And I think doubly it felt a little provocative because Robeson was a performer, performed in Yiddish and performed in Yiddish as a form of solidarity. And I'm a performer who performs in Yiddish as a form of self-expression. And here I was, as a performer performing the work of another performer. We both perform in Yiddish, and there's no where's the beef? I believe the question is. So
yeah, but as we've talked about, and we can go into this now, or we can talk a little bit more about process either way. But there was so many, Robeson is so vast. He's such a huge figure that you couldn't tackle all of it. And I know
many Robesons.
There's so many Robesons, which I know, there may be another iteration of this where you explore a different facet of Robeson, and there could be several iterations, as we talked about. So do you want to talk now about process, or do you want to go into more into that area about the things that we didn't cover, that you didn't get a chance to cover in the piece?
I think I can do both at the same time.
Okay, great.
So originally, when we had decided to put this together, I wanted a way to sort of embody the different Robesons there were, but given the amount of effort it took just to do this one particular aspect of Robeson, that is Robeson speaking to the issue of white supremacy in the United States, it didn't feel like I necessarily had enough time, efforts, or resources to be able to cover all of the other sort of iterations, which involved Robeson and labor, which involved his identity as an internationalist, and these other sort of aspects of Robeson as a performer and as an icon of these issues. So basically, it became really important for me to focus on one aspect, and as I did that, I would say the project really started to develop and started to move in various directions. It's interesting working with Robeson's engagement with racism in the United States, because you can basically go directly from his words in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. And then you can pick up a newspaper and you can read about any number of subjects, and very little has changed. Mm-hmm. It felt very relevant, and it actually felt like a privilege to be able to interact and even to some degree perform the words of this person who's so actively thinking about this issue.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Did you want to add anything, Robbie?
I was just how interesting it was, to think about the way that the project evolved, especially like in terms of its engagement specifically with the question of white supremacy, which made it so, it really brought home why we initially, it was interesting because the initial reason that we were talking about this was because of the relevance, the continued relevance of Robeson. And then the moment, after George Floyd, after the BLM, revolt, really, all of this, it felt like that Robeson could speak directly to this, and it really shifted the direction of it. And that was also, I hope we can get back to this a little bit, but it was also interesting to see the way that still, a certain amount of the audience who came to see the performance was still demanding that other things would be addressed. And particularly, the organization is Yiddishkayt. Why aren't you performing it? You perform the Yiddish songs. That's your connection. Like, why won't you do that for us? And that kind of attitude, given the historic moment, the moment that we're in right now. And, there was a way that I loved how Anthony at the beginning was talking about the idea, this kind of the house I live in. And then you say, like, the house is always, it's still on fire.
It's always been on fire. Yes.
It's always been on fire. And to be able to carry that through. And then there was an interesting way that moment, the moment just now that we're living in, could absolutely be enhanced by, taught by, instructed by Robeson, was such an important experience. And it was, for me, like watching the kind of audience, some of not, obviously this wasn't, I probably paid much more attention to the negative comments than to the positive, but the people who were, saying, why aren't you singing in Yiddish? That kind of thing. And I was like, look at the moment, like kind of read the moment that we're in right now. And that was a really interesting way that this performance, which originally we had talked about the multilingual aspect of it and all these things, it was meeting the demands of our time.
And I want to add that, the interviews that you conducted during the piece, obviously we're so present and so resonant. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your choices around doing that, and your experience of talking to people live and in the moment, and how that, because it was very profound. And for me personally, I hadn't seen anything like that before, where people are directly engaging in conversation around what was going on.
So this performance project, at least this iteration of it, was really sort of based on a quote of Robeson's from a piece that he wrote in 1957 for the Daily Worker, titled "Robeson Urges Government Defend the Constitution Against Racists." And the quote is, "History demands united action on the part of the people of our country to put an end to myths of white superiority." And what I wanted to try to do was to almost look at what that would look like in action in the confines of a performance. And I did it as well. So what I asked my audience participants to do was to really sort of engage in a form of storytelling about their own earliest sort of experiences of the myth of white superiority. And then I told a story as a way of kind of opening up the room for that, about early experiences that I had with the myth of white superiority. And then later in the piece, I interviewed an artist or another kind of creative person and asked, okay, so how through your work do you see an opportunity to bring an end to these myths of white superiority that, directly from this quote that I have from Paul Robeson? Like how, as a creative person, are you doing that? Because, he specifically says, even though the article is titled "Robeson Urges Government Defend Constitution Against Racists," this quote says, "History demands united action on the part of the people of our country," not necessarily its leaders, not necessarily its thought leaders, or anything like that, but specifically like regular people.
Right.
And I also wanted to sort of isolate the work of ending white supremacy as a creative act, and to bring other people sort of into the process of thinking about what that looked like. What this project ultimately was supposed to be was me sort of actively thinking about what that looked like and sort of bringing people into what that experience was.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
is.
and
I mean, it's continuing.
absolutely. And I think the artists and the folks involved in the interviews were greatly impacted by the conversations, just from the feedback that I know we all received. And what I'd love to do now is to just show that second film, The House We Live In. So let's go ahead and do that.
I grew up more or less middle class in the 80s and 90s, when I thought I didn't have to become a political thinker, because no one was literally coming to my neighborhood to burn my house down. But when I look back, I realize there was smoke and ashes everywhere. Now, in order to speak from the house I live in, the house we are all living in, I have to acknowledge that some part of it has always been on fire. In the light of this fire, I find myself standing, confronted by a program of evil men, which would destroy the last remnants of democracy in America. It has caused the federal government to vacillate and procrastinate in a manner menacing to the interest of the American people. History demands united action on the part of the people of our country to put an end to the myths of white superiority.
Evening breeze is sighing, moon is in the sky. Little man, it's time for bed. Daddy's little hero is tired and wants to cry. Now come along and rest your weary head. Little man, you're crying, I know why you're blue. Someone took your kitty cat away. You better go to sleep now, little man, you've had a busy day.
Great. So just having watched it again, we saw it so many times in February, but sort of revisiting it again. What are your thoughts, and seeing it now, and does it bring back any feelings about the time that in which you created it? Just wondering how it's landing for you today.
It's interesting because I'm realizing how much footage I took from either news stories or coverage of political actions that were happening when I was a child, and how many I was taking from parallel footage from today, and just how similar they are. There's footage of a young Black woman who's sort of very passionately and angrily speaking, and she's like pointing and she's yelling. That was actually taken from footage of a visit that Ronald Reagan took to the Bronx during his election. And the Bronx came out to meet him, and they let him know exactly what they thought of him and what he was going to do to the country. And it felt really important for me to include that as something that I didn't necessarily have access to as a young child. And then to take footage of protests and of rallies that were happening in 2020. There was so many things that were going on at that time, and I really wanted to be able to have a visual counterpoint in relationship to Robeson's words, because there was a point at which I was sort of talking about my childhood and my life growing up in the 80s and the 90s, and it sort of melds into Robeson's words when he's talking about people who are vacillating and not acting in a particularly effective manner to address racism in the United States. That last footage of a young woman climbing the ladder and then bringing down that statue, like that had happened basically that year. And I wanted to use these images to really illustrate not only the things that Robeson was talking about, but like actions that were taken in order to address that. So yeah, it's just a lot. When I make films, in addition to all the other kind of creative work that I do writing, and I do composing, I do singing, and I do performing of various kinds. It always comes from a very vibey place. I'm always looking to evoke a vibe. I think, like, for me, there's great sort of consistency in my work. Like when I'm a singer, I'm also looking to create a vibe emotionally in my in the people in my audience and the people who are listening to me sing. And visually, I'm trying to do that as well. Try to bring in as many images and sort of impressions that one can in order to establish a mood so that the message can kind of go through on that.
Absolutely. I mean, it works so beautifully. And I just wanted to pick up on something that you said about the texts, choosing the text. You chose some for the film and then also throughout the piece. And I wonder if maybe you want to speak to that aspect of the piece.
So that was one of the most complicated, and I'd say I had a giant book. I can show you. It's quite big, called Paul Robeson Speaks. And actually, my husband got it for me for my birthday one year, just as a gift, not knowing that like eventually I would be using this book almost as a Bible. But I really did a lot of reading of Robeson's thinking and his rhetoric and speeches that he had given. And I also wanted to bring in his song text as well as kind of an extension of that. So they came from a lot of different places. I mean, starting with the music, I sang a medley as a part of the performance. So in that was Lonely Road, which was by Henrik Inge from the film Song of Freedom from 1936. There's The House I Live In, which is by Earl Robinson and Abel Miracle, who's famous for being involved in writing Strange Fruit. So that was from a film, Let Freedom Sing, from 1942. There's Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child, which is, of course, a traditional spiritual. But the text of the piece that I performed came from a lot of different places. There was an oration that was delivered by Robeson at his graduation from Rutgers. There was an article, Thoughts on the Color Bar, which from the London Spectator in 1931. There was an article in the Chicago Defender from 1935 under the title, I Don't Want to Be White. A really important source for me was a speech that he gave at a rally that was sponsored by the National Joint Committee for Spanish Relief in aid of the Spanish refugee children at Royal Albert Hall in 1937, called The Artist Must Take Sides. There it is. Like, right. There was a really important sort of resource for me, that particular speech that he gave. There's another one, Why I Joined Labor Theatre, which was from an interview that he gave to the Daily Worker in London in 1937. And there was an interview that he gave to Mediodía, a publication that was based out of Cuba from when he was in Spain. So like there were these various sources from which I took my text and sort of folded them into what I was doing, because I wanted people to have an experience of Robeson as a thinker on this particular subject. Not only as a thinker, but really as an agitator, right? As somebody who was really spurring people to political motion, to political movement. And I wanted to be able to have those words as an element, an active element in what I was doing and what people were watching. There's an aspect of Robeson that I think can be taken in quite passively, which is listening to the beauty of Robeson's voice. It's a very easy thing to do. I can tell you, every time you've played something where Robeson was singing, it's been very hard for me to want to do much more than continue listening to what Robeson is doing. So I wanted to be able to provide that aspect of what Robeson brought to his performance, but I also wanted to be able to extract his words and to be able to present them to an audience, to be able to hear and to be able to think, and hopefully to be able to act as well.
How did you feel about the balance, would you say, between, it was so hard, I think, to figure out how to strike a balance between, also the musical part of it versus the spoken part, the oratory, the orational part of it. And then also there's the part that, like you're saying, balancing expectation versus what people were going to get, since most people expect to be passively sitting, listening to you sing, or to Robeson sing. So how did you strike a balance? And did you feel like that balance worked out, or how do you feel about that?
It's interesting. I'd like to think that people who came to the performance had the privilege of being able to be invited into kind of the personal, private contents of my thinking as a performer, right? So that they could hear the performance part, but they could also interact with my reality as being a Black person who's a performer, and Robeson's reality of being a Black person who's a performer, and what the relationship was between my experience of being a Black person in the United States and their experiences of witnessing the phenomenon of white supremacy in the United States. So it was hard. I want to think that there was a continuity between all of these things, and I wasn't sort of making a bargain, okay, I'll sing a little bit and then you'll stick around and hear me talk about white supremacy. I hope that people really realize that one was specifically sort of related to the other, that it was of a piece in a way that I think it was of a piece for Robeson. It wasn't like Robeson was okay, now I'm going to sing, and then now you're going to hear me talk about any number of things. No, it was all his concerts were consciousness raising events. And I know that they were, because I've interacted with any number of people who either attended his concerts as children and could still talk about the palpable sense of movement that they got from being in his presence as a performer and as a person. And then you can get it secondhand just by watching it and seeing how his voice and who he was and what he stood for acted on the hearts and minds of his listeners. So it's so funny. I'm getting very passionate right now. I'm sitting in my living room in Acton, Massachusetts, but talking about this, Robeson is there as an example of how to be politically engaged and how to be provocative in the best way as a performer, as somebody whose artistic abilities allow people to sit in space with them and listen and make them listen to them. I find him immensely inspirational.
I cannot believe it's almost time, which is unbelievable, because we could keep talking and talking and talking. It's so wonderful. I just want to sort of ask you about the future of the project. Anything that you're working on that you want to share with us? And I know that we've been talking a little bit about what sort of possible iterations might come out of this. So is there anything you want to share about that?
I would love to do another iteration of this project, and for it specifically to be about Robeson and labor, because it's something that, as a working person in the United States, I've interacted with very directly. I've worked in various sectors of work, and I've had various experiences, and they've been mostly negative. And I think it would be really interesting to really sort of bring Robeson back into that conversation. As with racism, a perpetual conversation, especially in the United States. I mean, we have the news of last week of there being a union, with Amazon, which seemed like it was impossible, but somehow we've gotten there. And then the next day, of course, I read an article that's saying, like, it's not going to last for very long. So, like, the struggle continues, right? So I think it would be really great to bring Robeson into that conversation and to see what he had to say about this as an issue. There was a lot of poetry that I interacted with and still feel very strongly about, very inspired by on my Helix trip. And I'm finally in the finishing stages of releasing an album with my duo partner, Dimitri Gaskin, and an amazing klezmer trio based out of the Bay Area called Bamela. An album of my settings of a lot of these poems. I just had a performance at UCLA last week, and I performed some of my settings there. And it's just, interacting with the work of these Yiddish poets, these modernist Yiddish poets from the first half of the 20th century, in the places where they wrote the poetry, was so inspirational to me that, like, I got home and I just started writing, and I'm continuing to write. And it's been inspirational to Dimitri as well. I mean, he's written, beautiful settings of poetry by Celia Dropkin, Avram Raisin, Leibniz. He's created this amazing arrangement of a song that I wrote based on a Leibniz poem called In der Fremd. So we're hoping that album will be out by this summer. And this summer, I will be performing a number of those songs along with Dimitri Gaskin and Bamela at Yiddishkayt at the Yiddish Book Center. They're having an all-stars edition, so I'm very pleased and honored to be considered an all-star. I did perform there in 2018, so it's nice to be invited back.
Well, that's fantastic. We'll be sure to sort of promote all of that on our Facebook page, and we invite everybody in the audience to follow us on Facebook, find us on Twitter, and there'll be more in the future. We're excited, more to come. So thank you both, and till next time.
Till next time. Bis weiter.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And it was great to see you, Anthony. And I would also like to thank Claire Fester, who is actually sitting right near me here, for behind the scenes, everything that she does.
Claire's an angel. Yes, she should